Dr. Sarah Martinez had always believed that helping people was worth any risk. When the International Medical Organization asked her to join a relief mission in the conflict zone, she didn't hesitate. The region had been torn apart by civil war for 3 years, leaving thousands of refugees without basic medical care. Sarah packed her medical supplies and said goodbye to her family in California, promising to return in 6 months. The refugee camp was worse than anything she had imagined. Thousands of displaced families lived in makeshift tents with no running water or electricity. Children with hollow eyes wandered between the shelters, their clothes torn and dirty. The smell of smoke from cooking fires mixed with the stench of poor sanitation filled the air. Sarah set up her medical station in a converted shipping container and began treating patients. From dawn until late at night, among the refugees, was an elderly man named Hassan who had lost his entire family during a bombing. He helped Sarah translate when patients spoke only the local language. There was also Fatima, a young mother with 3 small children who had walked for weeks to reach the camp. Her youngest son, only 2 years old, suffered from severe malnutrition. Sarah worked tirelessly to save him, staying up through many nights to monitor his progress. The other aid workers warned Sarah that the situation was becoming more dangerous. Rebel forces were moving closer to the camp and government troops were retreating. The sound of distant explosions grew louder each day. Many international organizations began evacuating their staff, but Sarah refused to leave. She had made promises to her patients, especially to little children who depended on her care. One morning, Sarah woke to the sound of gunfire much closer than before. The camp administrator rushed to her clinic, his face pale with fear. He told her that all remaining international staff had to evacuate immediately. A helicopter would arrive in 2 hours to take them to safety. Sarah looked around at her patients waiting for treatment. Hassan sat with his granddaughter who had developed a high fever during the night. Fatima held her malnourished son, whose condition had finally started to improve. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She told the administrator she would stay behind to continue treating the refugees. He argued with her, explaining that the rebel forces showed no mercy to anyone they considered enemies. The government had already labeled all international aid workers as foreign spies. Sarah understood the risks, but she couldn't abandon the people who trusted her. She watched the helicopter disappear into the sky, carrying away her last connection to the outside world. The rebel forces arrived 3 days after the evacuation helicopter left. Sarah heard the rumble of trucks and motorcycles approaching the camp before dawn. She quickly gathered her most critical medical supplies and hid them in a secret compartment Hassan had built beneath her clinic floor. The refugees scattered like frightened birds, some hiding in their tents while others tried to flee into the surrounding desert. Armed men in mismatched uniforms stormed through the camp, kicking down tent flaps and shouting orders in the local language. Their leader, a young man with cold eyes and an automatic rifle, demanded to know where the foreign spies were hiding. Hassan stepped forward and tried to explain that Sarah was only a doctor helping sick children. The rebel leader struck him across the face with the butt of his weapon, sending the old man crashing to the ground. Sarah emerged from her hiding place when she saw Hassan bleeding. She couldn't watch innocent people suffer because of her presence. The rebels immediately surrounded her, pointing their weapons at her chest. They searched her clinic and destroyed most of her medical equipment, looking for communication devices or weapons. When they found only bandages and medicine, their leader accused her of being a government spy sent to gather intelligence on their movements. The rebels decided to make an example of Sarah to scare other international workers from entering their territory. They dragged her to the center of the camp and forced all the refugees to watch. Sarah tried to explain that she was only there to help sick people, but the rebels didn't care about her reasons. They tied her hands behind her back and left her kneeling in the hot sun without food or water for 2 days. Hassan and some of the other refugees secretly brought Sarah small amounts of water when the guards weren't watching. Fatima's recovered son drew pictures in the sand near where Sarah was held, trying to make her smile despite their desperate situation. The refugees whispered among themselves, planning ways to help their doctor, but they knew any attempt to free her would result in their own deaths. On the 3rd night, the rebel leader announced his decision. Sarah would be executed at sunrise as a warning to other foreign spies. He wanted the refugees to understand what happened to anyone who collaborated with outside forces. Sarah spent her last night looking at the stars and thinking about her family back home. She wondered if they would ever learn what happened to her. Despite everything, she didn't regret staying to help the refugees. She had saved lives and given hope to people who had lost everything. Hassan sat near her throughout the night, quietly singing traditional songs from his homeland to give her comfort during her final hours. As the first light of dawn appeared over the desert horizon, Sarah prepared herself for the end. The rebel leader and his men gathered around her, their weapons ready. The refugees huddled in their tents, too frightened to watch but unable to leave their doctor alone in her final moments. Hassan stood despite his injuries, determined to be there for Sarah as she had been there for so many others. Suddenly, the sound of approaching helicopters filled the air. The rebels looked up in confusion and fear as 3 military aircraft appeared over the camp. These weren't the same type of helicopters that had evacuated the aid workers. These were combat helicopters flying low and fast. The rebels shouted orders to each other and began running for cover, abandoning their plan to execute Sarah. The helicopters circled the camp while armed soldiers rappelled down on ropes. These weren't regular army soldiers. They moved with the precision and speed of elite special forces. Their uniforms had no national markings, but their equipment was advanced and their training obvious. The rebels tried to fight back, but they were overwhelmed within minutes. Most surrendered immediately when they realized they were facing professional military operators. The team leader, a tall man with steady eyes, approached Sarah where she knelt with her hands still tied. He cut her bonds with a combat knife and helped her to her feet. She was weak from days without proper food or water, but she managed to stand. The soldier asked if she was the American doctor they had come to find. Sarah nodded, still shocked that anyone had come for her at all. The soldier explained that her family had contacted every government agency and military unit they could reach when she missed her scheduled check-in calls. Her brother, a former Marine, had used his connections to locate a special forces unit operating in the region. The team had been tracking the rebel movement for days, waiting for the right moment to strike without endangering the refugees. Sarah looked around at the camp and saw the refugees emerging from their hiding places. Children ran to their parents while older people helped those who had been injured during the firefight. But Sarah noticed that many refugees were still sick and needed medical attention. She turned to the team leader and asked how much time they had before extraction. He told her the helicopters would return in 4 hours, giving them time to secure the area and prepare for departure. Sarah made another decision that surprised everyone. She asked the soldiers to help her set up a temporary medical station to treat the refugees before they left. The Special Forces team was initially reluctant to delay their extraction for medical work, but their leader understood Sarah's determination. He had seen the same dedication in military medics who risked their lives to save wounded soldiers. The team established a security perimeter around the camp, while Sarah retrieved her hidden medical supplies from beneath the clinic floor. Hassan, despite his injuries from the rebel beating, insisted on helping Sarah treat patients. His granddaughter's fever had worsened during the 3 days of chaos, and several other children showed signs of serious illness. Fatima brought her son, whose malnutrition had returned due to the lack of food during the rebel occupation. Sarah worked quickly, knowing that every minute was precious. The Special Forces medic, Sergeant Thompson, assisted Sarah with the more serious cases. He had advanced combat medical training, but Sarah's experience with tropical diseases and refugee health issues proved invaluable. Together, they stabilized several critical patients and provided basic treatment to dozens of others. The soldiers shared their emergency rations with the refugees who hadn't eaten properly in days. During the medical work, Sarah learned more about her rescue. Her family had never stopped fighting for her after she missed her scheduled communication. Her brother had contacted a private military contractor with connections to elite special forces units. The team had actually been on a different mission in the region when they received the extraction request. The team leader, Captain Rodriguez, had volunteered his unit because he had a sister who also worked as a humanitarian aid worker. As they worked, Sarah realized that rescuing her was only part of the problem. The refugees would still be in danger after she left. The rebel forces that had fled during the attack would likely return once the soldiers departed. The refugees had no way to defend themselves and nowhere else to go. The nearest government-controlled area was hundreds of miles away across dangerous territory. Sarah discussed the situation with Captain Rodriguez while they treated patients. She explained that these people had already lost everything and survived incredible hardships to reach the camp. Abandoning them now would mean certain death for many, especially the children and elderly. The captain understood her concern, but his orders were clear. Extract the American doctor and return to base. He didn't have authorization to evacuate hundreds of refugees or establish a permanent security presence at the camp. With extraction time approaching, Sarah faced an impossible choice. She could leave with the soldiers and return to safety, knowing that the refugees would likely face retaliation from returning rebel forces. Or she could stay and continue helping people who desperately needed medical care but risked being captured again or worse. The Special Forces team had already risked their lives to save her, and she didn't want their sacrifice to be meaningless. Captain Rodriguez pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. He told her that his team had been monitoring rebel communications during their approach to the camp. Intelligence indicated that a much larger rebel force was moving toward the area, possibly arriving within the next day or two. The small group that had held Sarah was just an advance unit. The main force would be too large for his team to handle, even with air support. Sarah looked around at the refugees she had grown to care about over the past months. Hassan sat with his granddaughter, whose fever had finally broken thanks to the antibiotics from Sarah's hidden supplies. Fatima smiled as she watched her son playing with other children, his strength returning. These people had become like family to her, and the thought of abandoning them felt like betrayal. The team's radio operator reported that the extraction helicopters were 10 minutes out. Captain Rodriguez told Sarah she had to make her final decision immediately. The helicopters couldn't wait on the ground due to the security risks. If she chose to leave, it had to be now. If she chose to stay, his team would have to leave without her, and there might not be another chance for rescue. Sarah made a request that surprised everyone. She asked if the Special Forces team could help evacuate at least some of the refugees, particularly the children and most vulnerable people. Captain Rodriguez explained that his helicopters didn't have capacity for additional passengers, and his mission orders didn't include refugee evacuation. However, he promised to report the refugee situation to his commanders and recommend immediate humanitarian assistance. As the sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, Sarah realized she had been looking at the problem the wrong way. Instead of choosing between saving herself or saving the refugees, she needed to find a way to help everyone. She asked Captain Rodriguez if his team could contact international refugee organizations and media outlets to report the situation at the camp. Sometimes public attention and international pressure could provide protection that military force couldn't. The captain agreed to make those contacts as soon as his team returned to base. Sarah made her final decision as the helicopters touched down in the desert near the camp. She would leave with the Special Forces team, but she would dedicate herself to bringing help back to the refugees. Her extraction could be the key to saving everyone if she used her freedom wisely. She quickly gathered the medical records of her most critical patients and gave Hassan detailed instructions for basic care until more help arrived. The old man understood her decision and blessed her for everything she had done for his people. Fatima pressed a small handmade bracelet into Sarah's hands, a gift her daughter had made from colorful threads. The refugees gathered to say goodbye, many with tears in their eyes. They knew Sarah had risked everything to stay with them, and now she was risking everything again to find them help. The helicopter ride to the military base felt surreal after months in the refugee camp. Sarah sat surrounded by heavily armed soldiers, flying over the same desert where she had nearly died. Captain Rodriguez told her that his commanders were already making calls to international aid organizations based on his initial reports. The story of an American doctor who had nearly been executed while helping refugees was exactly the kind of narrative that could generate worldwide attention and support. Within hours of reaching the base, Sarah was on a satellite phone with her brother and family back home. They had never stopped working to bring her home, and now they were ready to help her bring assistance back to the refugees. Her brother's military contacts, combined with her own connections in the medical and humanitarian community, created a powerful network of people willing to help. Sarah's story quickly spread through news media around the world. The image of a doctor who had risked execution rather than abandon her patients captured public imagination. Donations poured in from individuals and organizations wanting to help the refugees she had described. International pressure mounted on both the government and rebel forces to allow humanitarian access to the camp. 3 weeks after her rescue, Sarah returned to the region as part of a large international relief convoy protected by United Nations peacekeepers. The rebels had agreed to a temporary ceasefire to allow humanitarian aid, partly due to the international attention Sarah's story had generated. When she arrived at the camp, Hassan was waiting with his recovered granddaughter. Fatima's son ran to hug Sarah, his malnutrition completely cured. The refugees had survived, and now they would have the ongoing support they needed. Sarah had learned that sometimes the greatest act of courage is knowing when to ask for help, and that one person's determination to do what's right can inspire others to join the fight for justice and humanity.